It was 2:47 in the morning when Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez felt the temperature in Ward 7 plummet by 20 degrees. The fluorescent lights above her flickered in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, casting dancing shadows across the empty hospital corridors of Clark Air Base Hospital in the Philippines. She was conducting her routine security rounds, clipboard in hand, when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of military boots marching in perfect formation down the hallway behind her. Rodriguez turned, expecting to see late-shift medical personnel or perhaps security making their own rounds. The corridors stretched empty before her, bathed in sickly yellow light. The marching continued, growing louder, more distinct, the sharp crack of leather against linoleum echoing through the abandoned medical wing. What Rodriguez couldn't have known in that terrifying moment was that she had just become the latest witness to phenomena that had plagued this forgotten corner of American military history for over 3 decades. Clark Air Base Hospital sits like a concrete tombstone in the humid landscape of Pampanga Province, Philippines, 60 miles northwest of Manila. Today, its broken windows stare blindly across overgrown fields where American servicemen once walked between air-conditioned barracks and mess halls. But during its operational years from 1903 to 1991, this sprawling medical complex served as the final destination for thousands of wounded and dying American soldiers, sailors, and airmen fighting wars across the Pacific Theater. From the blood-soaked beaches of World War II to the steaming jungles of Vietnam, the wounded arrived here in endless waves, carried on stretchers through doors that would later refuse to stay closed, down hallways that would later echo with voices of the dead. The hospital's morgue, located in the basement levels beneath the main medical complex, processed more bodies during the Vietnam War than any other American military facility outside the United States. Between 1965 and 1975, over 12,000 American servicemen passed through these sterile chambers, their dog tags cataloged, their personal effects bagged and labeled, their bodies prepared for the long journey home. The morgue staff worked in shifts around the clock, handling the relentless flow of casualties from Southeast Asian battlefields. What they couldn't have anticipated was that some of those who died on the gurneys and operating tables above would refuse to leave. The first documented supernatural incident at Clark Air Base Hospital occurred in September 1973, when night shift supervisor Lieutenant Janet Morrison was completing patient rounds in the intensive care unit. Morrison, a 15-year veteran nurse who had served 2 tours in Vietnam field hospitals, was known for her unshakable composure under pressure. At approximately 11:30 p.m., while checking on a critically wounded Marine who had been airlifted from Da Nang earlier that day, Morrison observed what she would later describe in her official report as a uniformed male figure standing at the foot of bed 7, appearing to be checking on the patient. The figure wore what Morrison identified as standard Army dress uniform, complete with campaign ribbons and sergeant stripes. When Morrison approached to inquire about the soldier's presence in the ICU after visiting hours, the figure turned toward her, revealing a face that Morrison described as pale, with dark hollows where the eyes should be. The uniformed man walked directly through the closed door of the unit, disappearing into the corridor beyond. Morrison's report, filed with base security and medical administration, would have been dismissed as fatigue-induced hallucination if not for what happened 3 nights later. Corpsman Second Class David Chen was restocking medical supplies in the morgue's preparation room when he heard what sounded like multiple men engaged in conversation. The voices came from the main examination chamber, where Chen knew no living person should be present at 1:15 in the morning. Chen approached the chamber and listened at the door, hearing distinct male voices discussing what appeared to be military operations. References to grid coordinates, casualty reports, and extraction procedures. When Chen opened the door to investigate, he found the room empty except for 2 bodies awaiting transport to Dover Air Force Base the following morning. The conversation continued for several more minutes before gradually fading to silence. These incidents marked the beginning of what would become a decades-long catalog of supernatural encounters that would eventually catch the attention of paranormal investigators, military historians, and ultimately, the producers of Ghost Hunters International. But the early incidents were merely the opening notes of a much darker symphony that would crescendo throughout the mid-1970s as the Vietnam War reached its bloody conclusion and the number of bodies flowing through Clark's morgue reached unprecedented levels. The hospital's medical staff began to notice patterns in the supernatural occurrences that seemed to correspond directly with the intensity of combat operations in Southeast Asia during particularly heavy casualty periods. When medical flights arrived daily carrying wounded and dead from battles in Cambodia, Laos, and South Vietnam, the paranormal activity within the hospital reached fever pitch. Doors that had been securely locked would be found standing wide open at the beginning of each shift. Elevators would operate on their own, traveling between floors with no one inside, stopping consistently at the basement level where the morgue was located. Most disturbing of all, medical personnel began reporting encounters with patients who had died days or weeks earlier, still wearing their hospital gowns, still bearing the wounds that had killed them. In March 1975, as Saigon fell and the last American forces evacuated Vietnam, intensive care nurse Captain Sarah Williams experienced what she would later describe as the most terrifying encounter of her military career. Williams was working the night shift when she heard her name being called from the empty Ward 5, which had been temporarily closed for renovations. The voice was insistent, desperate, calling her name over and over, with increasing urgency. Against protocol, Williams entered the abandoned ward and found herself face to face with a young soldier she recognized, Private First Class Tommy Hendricks, a 19-year-old from Nebraska who had died from shrapnel wounds 3 weeks earlier. Hendricks appeared exactly as Williams remembered him from his final moments, his chest heavily bandaged, his face pale from blood loss. He reached toward Williams and spoke in a voice she described as like wind through broken glass, asking her to tell them back home what really happened. When Williams backed away in terror, Hendricks became agitated, his form flickering like a damaged television signal. Williams fled the ward, and when security investigated 15 minutes later, they found every door in the abandoned section standing wide open despite being locked and sealed for construction. The incident with Private Hendricks marked a turning point in the supernatural activity at Clark Air Base Hospital. What had previously been isolated encounters with individual spirits evolved into something far more complex and threatening. Medical staff began reporting what they described as aggressive paranormal activity incidents, where unseen forces seemed to deliberately interfere with medical procedures and patient care. In June 1975, emergency room physician Major Robert Hayes was treating a critically wounded Air Force pilot when surgical instruments began flying off tables and slamming into walls with tremendous force. The incident occurred during a life-saving surgery, and Hayes was forced to relocate the patient to another operating room while security personnel investigated the chaos in OR 3. No explanation was ever found for the incident, but the pilot survived his injuries. The summer of 1975 brought the most violent and well-documented paranormal encounter in the hospital's history. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Stone, a Navy nurse with 12 years of military medical experience, was conducting her nightly medication rounds when she encountered what she would later describe as the worst thing I've ever seen in 20 years of military service. Stone was walking through the corridor connecting Ward 3 to the central nursing station when she observed a group of uniformed men walking in formation down the hallway ahead of her. The men appeared to be supporting a wounded comrade, carrying him between them as they moved toward the elevator. Stone called out to offer assistance, assuming the group was comprised of servicemen helping an injured friend to the emergency room. When the men turned toward her voice, Stone realized that all 5 figures bore fatal wounds. Gaping chest injuries, missing limbs, faces marked by explosions and shrapnel. The wounded man they carried had no head. Stone stood frozen as the group approached her position. According to her statement, filed with base security the following morning, the lead figure, a sergeant with what appeared to be a severe abdominal wound, reached out toward her as if seeking help. When Stone backed away in terror, the sergeant's expression changed to one of rage. Stone reported feeling an overwhelming sense of anger and desperation emanating from the group. Suddenly, Stone was lifted off her feet and thrown backward down the corridor with tremendous force, landing hard against a medication cart 20 feet away. Security personnel found Stone unconscious with severe bruising along her back and arms, injuries consistent with being thrown against a solid surface. The corridor where the incident occurred was empty except for Stone herself. Stone's attack represented a dramatic escalation in the paranormal activity plaguing Clark Air Base Hospital, but it would not be the last. Throughout the remainder of 1975 and into 1976, medical staff reported increasingly violent encounters with supernatural forces. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation during critical procedures. Patients reported being awakened by the sensation of hands touching them, only to find their rooms empty. Most disturbing of all, several staff members reported encounters with what they described as the Screaming Man, a figure observed in the morgue area who appeared to be a young soldier in extreme agony, his mouth open in a perpetual, silent scream. The identity of the Screaming Man would remain a mystery until 1982, when hospital records clerk Margaret Foster discovered a misfiled casualty report from August 1969. The report detailed the death of specialist Kenneth Morrison, a 21-year-old medic from Oregon who had been severely wounded by a booby trap explosion near the Cambodian border. Morrison had been airlifted to Clark Air Base Hospital with catastrophic injuries, including severe burns covering 60% of his body and extensive internal trauma. Despite the best efforts of the medical staff, Morrison had died after 7 days of unimaginable suffering, conscious and in extreme pain until the end. According to the medical records, Morrison's final words were a desperate plea for someone to make it stop. The revelation of Morrison's story provided context for much of the paranormal activity observed in the hospital, but it also raised disturbing questions about the nature of the supernatural forces at work within the facility. If Morrison's spirit was indeed trapped within the hospital, reliving his final moments of agony, what did that mean for the hundreds of other servicemen who had died within these walls under similar circumstances? The implications were staggering. An entire legion of the dead, unable to find peace, trapped forever in the place where their young lives had ended in pain and fear. Hospital administration's response to the mounting reports of supernatural activity was swift and predictable: complete denial. Official military policy regarding paranormal claims was unambiguous. Such reports were to be treated as manifestations of stress, fatigue, or psychological instability. Staff members who filed formal reports of supernatural encounters found themselves subjected to psychiatric evaluation and, in some cases, reassignment to other facilities. The message was clear. Discussing ghosts was career suicide, but the supernatural activity at Clark Air Base Hospital proved impossible to suppress or ignore. By 1976, the incidents had become so frequent and so violent that even the most skeptical medical personnel were forced to acknowledge that something unexplainable was occurring within the facility. Ward supervisors began implementing unofficial protocols for dealing with paranormal encounters. Buddy system patrols during night shifts, rotating assignments to prevent prolonged exposure to supernatural activity, and informal counseling sessions for staff members who had experienced supernatural encounters. The most comprehensive documentation of the hospital's paranormal activity came from an unexpected source: Chief Security Officer Master Sergeant William Dutch Kowalski, a career military policeman who had served 3 tours in Vietnam before being assigned to Clark Air Base in 1974. Kowalski was a no-nonsense soldier with little patience for what he initially dismissed as ghost stories and fairy tales. His perspective changed dramatically after a series of encounters that began in October 1976 and continued until his retirement in 1979. Kowalski's first supernatural encounter occurred during a routine security sweep of the hospital's basement levels. At approximately 2:30 a.m., while inspecting the morgue facilities, Kowalski heard what he described as the sound of a full-scale riot coming from the main examination chamber. Voices shouting in apparent anger, the crash of overturning furniture, and what sounded like physical altercations between multiple individuals. Kowalski immediately called for backup and approached the examination chamber with his service weapon drawn. When he opened the door, he found the room in complete disarray. Gurneys overturned, medical equipment scattered across the floor, and examination tables shoved against the walls. The room was empty of living personnel, but the destruction was undeniable. The incident report filed by Kowalski documented property damage exceeding $3,000, but military investigators were unable to determine how the destruction had occurred. Security cameras in the area showed no evidence of human activity, yet the physical damage was extensive and consistent with vandalism by multiple individuals. Kowalski's report included a detailed inventory of the destroyed equipment and a recommendation for increased security patrols in the morgue area. 3 weeks later, Kowalski experienced what he would later describe as the most frightening encounter of his military career. While conducting a midnight inspection of the hospital's main corridors, Kowalski observed a group of approximately 20 uniformed men walking in formation through Ward 7. The men appeared to be carrying wounded comrades on improvised stretchers, moving with the urgent purpose of soldiers evacuating casualties from a battlefield. Kowalski followed the group, maintaining distance while observing their movements and attempting to determine their identity and purpose. The procession moved through the hospital corridors with obvious familiarity, navigating turns and doorways as if following a well-known route. Kowalski realized that the group was heading directly toward the morgue, following the same path that wounded servicemen would have taken when brought to the hospital for treatment. As the procession reached the elevator that led to the morgue level, Kowalski called out, identifying himself as security and requesting the group to halt for identification. The response was immediate and terrifying. According to Kowalski's report, the entire group turned toward him in perfect unison, revealing faces marked by fatal wounds, gunshot injuries, explosion trauma, and the unmistakable signs of violent death. The lead figure, a sergeant wearing Vietnam-era combat fatigues, approached Kowalski and spoke in a voice that the security chief described as like gravel in a cement mixer. The sergeant asked Kowalski if he was here to help them get home. When Kowalski backed away, drawing his service weapon, the sergeant's expression changed to one of desperate anger. The entire group began moving toward Kowalski, their wounded comrades now struggling on the stretchers, reaching toward the living man with desperate, grasping hands. Kowalski fled the scene, radioing for immediate backup while retreating to the security office. When reinforcements arrived 15 minutes later, they found the corridor empty except for wet footprints leading from the elevator to the morgue entrance. Footprints that appeared to be made by military boots, but which contained what appeared to be blood mixed with water. Laboratory analysis of samples taken from the footprints was inconclusive, with technicians noting unusual chemical compositions that didn't match any known biological or synthetic materials. The incident marked a turning point in Kowalski's attitude toward the paranormal activity at Clark Air Base Hospital. The career soldier who had initially dismissed supernatural reports as hysteria became the facility's most meticulous documenter of paranormal encounters. Between October 1976 and his retirement in August 1979, Kowalski filed over 200 incident reports detailing supernatural activity within the hospital complex. His reports, maintained in classified military files for over 2 decades, would eventually provide crucial evidence for paranormal investigators seeking to understand the true scope of the haunting at Clark Air Base. Kowalski's documentation revealed patterns in the supernatural activity that suggested the presence of multiple distinct entities within the hospital complex. Some encounters involved individual spirits who appeared to be seeking help or attempting to communicate with the living. Others involved groups of supernatural figures engaged in activities that seemed to mirror their final moments of life. Wounded soldiers seeking medical treatment, medical personnel continuing their duties beyond death, and most disturbing of all, what Kowalski described as command meetings, where ghostly officers appeared to be briefing subordinates on combat operations that had ended years or decades earlier. The most chilling entry in Kowalski's files detailed an encounter that occurred in March 1978, when the security chief observed what he described as a full medical procedure being performed by invisible personnel in Operating Room 2. Kowalski was conducting his nightly security rounds when he heard voices and the sounds of medical equipment coming from OR2, which had been closed for repairs earlier that day. Through the observation window, Kowalski observed surgical instruments moving through the air as if being manipulated by invisible hands, while voices discussed medical procedures and patient conditions. The invisible surgery continued for over an hour, with Kowalski watching in fascination and terror as a complete medical procedure was performed by entities that cast no shadows and left no physical evidence of their presence. When the invisible surgery concluded, Kowalski entered OR2 and found the room exactly as it had been left by maintenance personnel, surgical instruments clean and stored, equipment powered down. No evidence that any medical procedure had taken place. Yet Kowalski's detailed report documented the specific medical terminology he had overheard, the precise movements of the surgical instruments, and the apparent successful completion of what appeared to be emergency trauma surgery on an invisible patient. The implications of Kowalski's observations were staggering. If accurate, they suggested that the spirits haunting Clark Air Base Hospital were not merely trapped souls seeking rest, but conscious entities continuing to perform the duties they had carried out in life. Dead doctors were still treating patients, dead nurses were still providing care, and dead soldiers were still fighting wars that had ended years or decades earlier. The hospital had become a supernatural recreation of its operational years, populated by the ghosts of everyone who had died within its walls. By the late 1970s, the paranormal activity at Clark Air Base Hospital had reached such intensity that it began affecting the facility's operational efficiency. Medical personnel requested transfers to other bases at rates significantly higher than normal, citing environmental stress factors in their applications. Equipment malfunctions occurred with suspicious frequency, requiring constant repairs and replacements that strained the facility's maintenance budget. Most concerning of all, patient outcomes in certain areas of the hospital showed statistical anomalies that military medical investigators were unable to explain through conventional means. The mysterious pattern of patient outcomes centered on Ward 7, the same area where many of the most violent paranormal encounters had been reported. Patients assigned to Ward 7 showed recovery rates significantly lower than those in other areas of the hospital, despite receiving identical medical care from the same staff members. More disturbing, patients in Ward 7 frequently reported disturbing dreams involving uniformed men standing around their beds, and several claimed to have been awakened by the sensation of hands touching them during the night. Medical investigators reviewing the Ward 7 anomalies discovered that the area had the highest concentration of patient deaths in the hospital's history. Between 1943 and 1978, over 3,000 servicemen had died in Ward 7, making it the deadliest section of an already deadly facility. The investigators' report, classified at the time of its completion, concluded that environmental factors of unknown origin were contributing to reduced patient outcomes in the area, and recommended that Ward 7 be closed pending further investigation. The closure of Ward 7 in August 1978 temporarily reduced the paranormal activity within the hospital, but it also seemed to concentrate the supernatural forces in other areas of the facility. Staff members reported that encounters with supernatural entities became more frequent and more intense in the remaining active wards, as if the closure of Ward 7 had forced the hospital's ghostly inhabitants to relocate to new areas. The most dramatic escalation in paranormal activity following the Ward 7 closure occurred in December 1978, when emergency room physician Captain Michael Brady experienced what he would later describe as a supernatural medical emergency. Brady was treating a wounded Marine who had been injured in a training accident when the patient suddenly began convulsing and showing signs of severe distress. Brady's attempts to stabilize the patient were hampered by what he described as invisible interference. Medical equipment that refused to function properly, IV lines that came loose without explanation, and the overwhelming sensation that unseen entities were actively working against his efforts to save the patient's life. As Brady fought to stabilize his patient, he became aware that he was not alone in the emergency room. Although no other living personnel were present, Brady could hear voices providing medical instructions, the sound of additional equipment being used, and what appeared to be a coordinated medical response involving multiple invisible participants. The voices seemed to be trying to help, offering suggestions and warnings that Brady found himself following, despite their supernatural origin. Working in partnership with the invisible medical team, Brady was able to stabilize his patient and save the Marine's life. The incident left Brady profoundly shaken, but also convinced that the supernatural forces within the hospital were not uniformly malevolent. In his official report, Brady theorized that the hospital was haunted by medical personnel who had died while serving at the facility, and that these ghostly doctors and nurses were continuing to provide medical care beyond death. Brady's report sparked intense debate within the military medical community, with some physicians dismissing his claims as stress-induced hallucination, while others privately admitted to similar experiences during their own tours at Clark Air Base. The controversy surrounding Brady's report reached the attention of military investigators at the Pentagon, who launched a classified investigation into the paranormal claims at Clark Air Base Hospital. The investigation, codenamed Project Aftercare, involved interviews with over 200 current and former personnel, analysis of incident reports spanning 3 decades, and on-site investigation by a team of military specialists trained in unusual phenomena. The Aftercare investigation, completed in September 1979, concluded that anomalous events of unknown origin were indeed occurring at Clark Air Base Hospital, but stopped short of confirming the existence of supernatural activity. The report's classified appendix, not declassified until 2003, contained detailed documentation of paranormal encounters that investigators were unable to explain through conventional means. The appendix included audio recordings of voices captured in empty rooms, photographic evidence of unexplained figures in hospital corridors, and testimony from witnesses whose credibility and mental stability were beyond question. Most significantly, the Aftercare investigation uncovered evidence that the paranormal activity at Clark Air Base Hospital was not a recent phenomenon, but had been occurring since the facility's early operational years. Interviews with retired personnel revealed that supernatural encounters had been reported as early as 1944, during the height of World War II, when the hospital was processing casualties from the Pacific Theater campaigns. The pattern of activity had remained consistent across decades. Wounded soldiers seeking help, medical personnel continuing their duties beyond death, and violent outbursts from entities that appeared to be reliving traumatic final moments. The Aftercare report's most disturbing conclusion was that the paranormal activity at Clark Air Base Hospital appeared to be increasing in intensity over time, as if the accumulation of death and suffering within the facility was creating a supernatural resonance that grew stronger with each passing year. The investigators warned that continued operation of the hospital without addressing the underlying paranormal issues could lead to increasingly dangerous encounters that might threaten the safety of of both patients and staff. Military leadership's response to the aftercare findings was swift and decisive. The report was classified at the highest levels. Investigators were reassigned to other duties, and official policy regarding paranormal claims at Clark Air Base Hospital remained unchanged. The facility would continue operating normally, with supernatural encounters treated as individual psychiatric issues rather than systemic problems requiring institutional response. But the supernatural forces at Clark Air Base Hospital proved immune to military bureaucracy and official denial. Throughout the 1980s, as the facility transitioned from its wartime role to peacetime operations, the paranormal activity continued unabated. New generations of medical personnel encountered the same ghostly figures that had terrified their predecessors, walked the same haunted corridors where invisible armies marched through the night, and treated patients in wards where the dead refused to rest. The end of the Cold War and the closure of American military bases in the Philippines brought an end to Clark Air Base Hospital's operational status in 1991. But it did not bring peace to the facility's supernatural inhabitants. Local Filipino personnel hired to maintain the abandoned complex reported encounters with American servicemen who appeared unaware that the base had been closed. Security guards described hearing English-language conversations echoing through empty wards, the sound of medical procedures being performed in abandoned operating rooms, and the constant marching of invisible soldiers through corridors that had been sealed for years. The hospital's reputation as one of the most haunted locations in Southeast Asia attracted the attention of international paranormal investigators, including the team from Ghost Hunters International who visited the facility in 2009. The GHI investigation, broadcast as part of their Unknown Soldiers episode, captured compelling evidence of supernatural activity within the abandoned hospital complex. Electronic voice phenomena recorded in the morgue area included apparent responses to investigators' questions, while thermal imaging cameras detected unexplained temperature fluctuations in areas where violent paranormal encounters had been reported decades earlier. The GHI team's most significant finding was the discovery of what appeared to be residual haunting patterns throughout the hospital complex, supernatural imprints of traumatic events that seemed to replay endlessly within the abandoned facility. The investigators documented apparent reenactments of medical procedures, emergency responses, and patient deaths that occurred with clockwork regularity, as if the hospital's walls had recorded the most intense moments of human suffering and were playing them back for eternity. Today, Clark Air Base Hospital stands as a crumbling monument to the thousands of American servicemen who fought and died in conflicts across the Pacific. Its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls tell the story of a facility that has been abandoned by the living, but never truly emptied. Local residents still report seeing lights in the windows late at night, hearing the sound of helicopters that never land, and encountering uniformed figures walking the perimeter roads that once connected the hospital to the active base. The ghosts of Clark Air Base Hospital represent more than simple supernatural phenomena. They are the lingering echoes of America's military presence in the Pacific, the unquiet spirits of young men who died far from home in service to their country. Their continued presence within the abandoned facility serves as a reminder that some wounds never heal, some duties never end, and some sacrifices demand eternal recognition. For the medical personnel who served at Clark Air Base Hospital during its operational years, the supernatural encounters they experienced were not merely frightening anomalies, but profound confrontations with the cost of war. Every ghostly figure they encountered represented a life cut short, a family destroyed, a future erased by the violence of modern conflict. The hospital's haunting was not just about the dead refusing to rest. It was about the living being forced to confront the true human cost of the wars they served. The paranormal activity at Clark Air Base Hospital continues to this day, witnessed by urban explorers, paranormal investigators, and local residents who venture too close to the abandoned complex. Reports describe the same phenomena that terrified military personnel decades earlier. Uniformed figures walking through walls, the sound of invisible medical procedures, and violent encounters with entities that seemed desperate to communicate with the living world. The story of Clark Air Base Hospital's haunting is ultimately a story about memory and sacrifice, about the price of forgetting and the power of the dead to demand remembrance. The thousands of servicemen who died within its walls have found a way to ensure that their sacrifice will never be truly forgotten, that their presence will be felt long after the last American soldier has left Philippine soil. In the tropical heat of Pampanga province, where jungle vegetation slowly reclaims the abandoned runways and barracks of what was once America's largest overseas military installation, Clark Air Base Hospital stands as a testament to the enduring power of human memory and the refusal of the war dead to fade quietly into history. The marching feet that echo through its corridors, the voices that call out in the darkness, and the invisible hands that still reach out for help serve as eternal reminders that some debts can never be fully paid, some stories can never be completely told, and some ghosts will never find peace. The legacy of Clark Air Base Hospital is written not just in medical records and casualty reports, but in the supernatural encounters that continue to this day. It is a legacy that demands we remember not just the strategic importance of American military presence in the Pacific, but the individual human cost of that presence. The young men who died in agony on foreign soil, far from home, their final moments witnessed only by the walls that still echo with their cries for help. As darkness falls over the abandoned hospital complex each night, and the temperature drops in rooms that have been empty for decades, the ghosts of Clark Air Base Hospital continue their eternal vigil. They walk the same corridors where they once served. They tend to patients who exist only in memory, and they march in formation toward battles that ended long ago. They are the eternal guardians of America's forgotten war dead, ensuring that their sacrifice will be remembered long after the last witness has passed away and the last official record has been sealed. The haunting of Clark Air Base Hospital is not just a ghost story. It is a chapter in American military history that has never been fully told, a testament to the young men who gave their lives in service to their country and found a way to ensure that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. In the broken windows and crumbling walls of an abandoned hospital in the Philippines, the price of American military power is written in the voices of the dead, demanding that we remember not just the victories and defeats of war, but the individual human cost of every conflict, every battle, and every life lost in service to flag and country.